A couple things to make you aware of. One, I want you to know that in 2 weeks, we'll have baptisms. And so if you've not been baptized in water since you put your faith in Jesus, there is not a better Sunday for you to do that than in 2 weeks. And so in the seat back in front of you, okay, everybody look at it. There should be a card, and if not, there's one around you. All you have to do, grab that card, turn it in the offering receptacle, and we'll be ready for you in 2 weeks to baptize you. We always love those Sundays. That'll be our last one until after Easter. So if you're looking for that little nudge, there it is. And then I want you to be aware of something that we're doing next weekend. And it's always a little bit scary to do this event again. And it's pancakes and pajamas. We're bringing it back. And here's why it's scary, okay? I think it was the first time. It might have been the second time. It doesn't really matter. But we did it right before. Like the last time I remember doing it before last year was it was the first Sunday in March 2020. I don't know if you guys remember what happened after that. The world closed is what happened. The world literally closed down, and it was like, we kind of think that we caused it with pancakes and pajamas. But we did it last year, and nothing happened, and so we're going to try it again. And so pancakes and pajamas are next weekend. It's a great event. If you have friends that don't have a church home, this is a great event to bring them to. It'll be a lot of fun. There'll be all kinds of excitement out in our lobby. You're an adult. You can wear pajamas any day you want to wear them, really. I'm not going to wear them, and I'm not saying you should, but your kids can. I don't care what you do. Just eat the pancakes and be happy, okay? But that's happening, so be sure to be there. Invite your friends. It'll be a lot of fun. But we got that happening. But even just kind of thinking about clothes, okay, and like pajamas or clothes. There was a season in my life where it probably lasted about a year, where I was into thrifting clothes. I don't know if you've been there. It was my college years. I think a lot of college kids get into it. I thought it was funny because you could buy stuff that was ironic, and so I'd buy ironic shirts from time to time. And there was one shirt that I found that I particularly loved, and it actually lasted far beyond my thrifting phase. I actually found it on Poshmark. Okay, so this is it. It's a March Madness. I think it was 1985. It doesn't really 87. My 87 shirt. It's like the Final Four teams, which I love March Madness and I love thrifting, so it was kind of like two worlds coming together. I got rid of all of the clothes that I thrifted except for that shirt, and it would come out every March. It was like my March Madness shirt, okay? Like I really loved to wear it, and I wore it for like a decade. It was March comes around, I'm wearing my shirt, watching the games, eating wings, whatever, and about 10 years into me wearing this shirt every March, I was going out. My lovely wife, Joanna, said to me, "Do you think that's a little small?" Mind you, I've been wearing it for 10 years at this point. So way beyond, she was just waiting for the courage to tell me, I guess. And so she told me, she's like, "Yeah, I think it's a little small." And I was offended, obviously, because it was an adult small, but I fit fine in it. And so I was like, "No, it's March Madness. It's my March Madness shirt. I wear it every March. What do you mean?" All that kind of stuff. And so then I went to an event here at the church, and I'm, wearing my March Madness shirt. It was like a March Madness thing. And I went up to one of my friends at the church, and I said, "Can you believe that Joanna told me that this was too small?" And he was like, "It's way too small." And that was the last time I wore that shirt. And I don't know if you ever had that moment where you're wearing something and then all of a sudden, all you can think about is what you're wearing. Like, that was it. I was like, how do I get out of here and change the shirt? Like, what am I doing? 10 years, what is going on? Like, 10 years I wore this thing. And that's kind of what Paul's saying here as we come to Ephesians 4. So we're walking through it. He's kind of saying, okay, he's like, hey, thinking about your old way of life, it's like a shirt that doesn't fit. You got to change. And really the theme of what we're going to look at here is Paul is he's using a metaphor, and he's saying your old way of life is like old clothing. And really it's time for you to change clothing. And so before he gets to that metaphor, we see him start by just telling him, hey, you need to listen to what I'm saying. And we'll pick it up in Ephesians 4, verse 17. And Paul says this. He says, "Now this I say and testify in the Lord, that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do in the futility of their minds." Now, I say this, I do this sometimes. It's like, Ryan, what's the point if you underline everything, what's the point of underlining anything? And like, I get it, like it's there, it's underlined, but here I am doing it again, okay? So whatever, you can judge me, but I'm the one who kind of made the PowerPoint. So like, but what is he saying? Okay, I don't know if you ever had this moment with your kids, where like you're telling them something, and like, you don't know if they're listening. And so what do? You're like, hey, I'm gonna stop. I need you to look at me in the face, right? Hey, I need to make sure that you really hear what I'm saying. This is important, and you're not. And so Paul, I mean, we're 4 chapters, almost 5 chapters, like 4 whole chapters into the book of Ephesians. And this is what Paul's doing, is he's saying, okay, I've covered a lot of ground. I've said a lot of things that are really important. I can't have you checking out on me right here. And what it's his way of like looking at you in the face, making sure that you're listening. And you see that because he uses 2 words that basically mean the same thing. He says, I testify, and he says, now this I say. Same idea. And he's saying, I need to make sure that you're hearing this. And then he throws this addendum on the back of it where he says, in the Lord. So he's like, I just want you to make no mistake about this, okay? Not only do I want to make sure that you're listening, I want you to know that it's not me talking here, but this is what God would say. And he's saying, hey, what God would say is that when you were a Gentile, you lived differently. And you cannot go back to that way of living. And he uses a phrase to describe that way of living that, to be honest with you, is like, it's rich. It's the word futility, okay? And I love the way that Lynn Cohick in her commentary defines this word. I love it so much that I'm going to put it on the screen. I want you to hear it. And he says this, he says, interestingly, Paul does not lead with the claim that such actions are bad, like going back to the Gentile way of living, that they're bad or wrong, although they certainly are. There's much sadness, pain, and regret packed into the word futile. That it is an endless striving and never arriving, forever searching and never finding. The reason why I think that grabbed me so much is, gosh, that just feels like my life before I found Jesus. Pursuing all kinds of stuff, never really worked. Like I felt like I was always striving and never really got where I was trying to go. That I thought maybe this thing would be the thing that answers all of my questions, and then it didn't. Like that's the idea. And what's interesting is before he gets to the word futile, he brings up an image that he's already brought up in Ephesians 4. And he's brought it now, this is the 3rd time he brings it up, and it's the image of a walk. And what Paul is saying is he's saying that this way of life, the Gentile way of life, that he's like, your life with Christ is on a path. And to walk like a Gentile would be to not only walk on an entirely different path, but it's also to walk in an entirely different direction. Basically saying, like, your life is a walk. Your life is a journey. And there is somewhere that Christ wants you to go, and if you're not heading towards him, you're heading somewhere else. And then he paints a picture as the text goes forward of what this looks like. And you see it here in verses 18 and 19, and he says this. He says, they, talking about the living like a Gentile, they are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardness of their hearts. They have become callous and have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity. But the NEB version of the Bible, it translates it like this. It says that they stop at nothing to satisfy their foul desire. But John Stott, he actually in his commentary, he points out the progression into like futility in the text, and I find it really helpful. He says that it starts with the hardness of heart. It leads to darkness of mind. From there, it goes to the deadness of the soul. And then finally, it ends in reckless life. And it's true. I mean, think about your relationship with sin. Like, your relationship with sin probably rarely starts with you running headfirst into debauchery. But it starts slowly, doesn't it? And it's a slow creep into heading somewhere that, honestly, if you would have been told when you started that you were going, you'd have been like, I would have never wanted to go there. And what Paul is pointing out is he's saying, yeah, that's how it works. You start off in a direction, you head down a path, and next thing you know, you don't even look like yourself. But what I think is so interesting here is that he mentions the mind as much as he does. And if you think about sin, like, it doesn't start with your actions so much as it often starts in your mind, doesn't it? Like, you start by justifying things that you wouldn't normally justify. You tell yourself, you know what, I don't think this is that big of a deal. And it starts here before it comes to your feet. Like, that is how it starts. And you see here in the text that a sinful mind leads to a sinful life. And man, the picture that Paul paints of this life that is heading towards futility, it is one that I don't know that any of us would really want to pursue. He starts by mentioning that those who are on that path, they're calloused. And callousness, it has to do with a few things. One, it's a callous person. They don't care about other people. They don't care about how their actions impact other people. There's no concern about that. It's really just about them. And there's also this, with the idea of callousness, not just towards other people, but there's also this callousness towards God, where it's this thought where it's like, well, I know that this isn't what God would want for me, but I don't care. I know this isn't God's plan, but I don't care that this isn't God's plan. I'm going to do whatever I want. And then beyond that, it talks about sensuality, which is, honestly, it's talking about any sexual activity that would be outside of God's plan for marriage. But even beyond that word, it broadly reflects any behavior that's deemed offensive and lacking restraint. And then he says every kind of impurity, and it's just this idea, this broad stroke of sin. And it's this picture of sin that's to fully indulge, or even to partially indulge, it will lead to it consuming all of you. And it's really important as you look there at the text where it says that they gave themselves up. Because sometimes we'll do this, man, where it's well, the heart was hard, so they didn't really have any choice in the matter. But what Paul's saying, he's saying, no, they gave themselves up. That there comes a point with these people on this path where they willfully decided that they weren't going to do what God wanted them to do. It might have started with their heart being hard, but eventually it was a decision where they said, I'm going to walk on a different path. And when you think about verses 18 and 19, it paints a picture, and it's maybe a picture that we wouldn't initially think of, but it's a picture of idolatry. Now, you heard the word idolatry, you think of praying to a statue or worshiping an image, and that's not what he's talking about, but it's talking about an idolatry that I think that we struggle with. And with us, our idol probably isn't the image or the statue, that our idol is ourself. And the person here in verses 18 and 19 is a person who worships themselves. There's no thought of others. There's no thought of what God would want. That the only thing that is on their mind is doing what they want to do for themselves. And Paul's like, that is a path that will lead to futility. And then he's like, okay, but there's a Christian way. He's like, that's the bad way. That's the path that you don't want to go down. But then you could just change your clothes. And you see that here in verse 20 where he says this, but that's not the way you learned Christ. Assuming that you heard about him and were taught in him as the truth is in Jesus. To put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to put on the new self, created after the likeness of God, in true righteousness and holiness. The image here is Paul saying it's like it's putting off old clothes, putting on new clothes. And I read somewhere that Paul's making an illustration and that it's like there's a way to dress that's appropriate in certain situations. Like that's kind of what he's saying. And I know that like as a society, like we've gotten a lot more casual, and I think that's great. Okay, like I'm all for that. I'm glad I'm not wearing a tie right now. I think we all are. I mean, really, our society's gotten really casual. But if I wear a suit in public, like I'm wearing a black suit and a tie, people will come up to me who don't know me, and they'll be like, "Man, what are you all dressed up for?" And it's always a funny interaction because the answer is usually a funeral. And so they're like always taken aback, and then they're like, "I'm so sorry," and it's always really awkward for them. But what he's saying, like there's a way to dress, and though we've gotten more like casual, like I mean, we'd still say there are some things you shouldn't wear to certain places, right? Like you probably shouldn't wear a swimsuit to a funeral, right? Like that'd be, and if you wore like a swimsuit to a funeral, like someone should take you aside and be like, "Hey, let's go. Let's change clothes." And kind of what Paul is saying is he's like, if you're going to say you're a Christian, but you're going to behave like you behaved as a Gentile, you're wearing a swimsuit to the funeral. And it's time for you to change your clothes. And you see that idea where he's saying, okay, you put off the old self and you put on the new. And it starts with the mind, kind of like how it did there, but it's a renewing of the mind instead of just like this mind that does whatever it wants. And he's saying that as you do this, like you are moved into behavior that would be like how God wants you to behave. But if you think of the bookend of the chapter, what does Paul say that we do? He says that you're like God in righteousness and holiness. And righteousness has to do with doing the right things, behaving a certain way. And so it's like what you do. And holiness has more to do with like who you are. Like the essence of who you are, that you're internal. And Paul's like, as you put on new clothes, this is what happens. And you hear that and you think about it and it's like, it seems hard. Like but I like the way that Brian Chappell says it in his commentary, and he's like, though it's maybe difficult to change, the most joy that you will find is walking in righteousness and holiness. The most joy that you'll find in your life is living the way that he wants you to live. Sure, there might be moments where you do something that he doesn't want and it doesn't like backfire like you would think, and you're like, okay, dodged a bullet there. But the truth is that if you want to experience the joy that he has for you to experience, it just makes sense that the best way to do that is to walk in the way that he designed the world. And as we think about that, so then how do we walk in that joy? What does Paul say to do? And there are three actions here in the text that Paul would tell us to do as we are transformed into this image that God wants us to be transformed into. And I'll look at those as we apply it. The first one is this, is to put off your old self. Paul says to put off your old self. I mean, that's literally the language that he uses. Look at verse 22 where he says, put off your old self, which belongs to your former way of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires. I think that like this idea of putting off your old self, I think there's a part of this that's like really hard and difficult. And I think there's also maybe a part of this that's really encouraging. I think the part of it that's really difficult is that some of what Paul is getting at is that there are parts of your old life that will always hang around. Like there's going to be residue from your old clothes. I mean, I imagine some of you are in here and you think of your relationship with God. And maybe God has given you victory over something. And what I mean by victory is I mean that you haven't indulged in that thing for a long time. So that's what I mean by victory. And even as you've walked in that, like part of the reality of your life is that that thing still finds a way to tempt you, doesn't it? Which can be very frustrating, can be very discouraging. It can also be bring this sense of like, I thought I moved past that. Like I have to keep putting this off? I mean, and even just to use the examples that are in the text, like I imagine those are probably things that people struggle with. You think of, he mentions greed. You know, and when you talk about greed, all of us are like, that's not me, I'm not rich. Yeah, I don't know that greed's a rich person thing. I think we like to think that it is, because then we can blame them. But the truth is, if you look at just how the Bible like talks about greed, I mean, greed can be defined as not being satisfied with what you have. Like, greed can be defined as like wanting what someone else has. That even thinking about greed, like greed can say, greed in its sense could be, I know there is a need that I can meet, but I'm going to say no to it so that I can accumulate more for myself. And maybe in your life, God has like helped you with that. Like he's helped you overcome that you're like, man, I don't know. Like, I mean, it's always creepy, but I feel pretty good. The reality that's before us with the residue of our old clothes is that even if we get beyond that, there's still going to be a temptation to hold on. There's still going to be a temptation to be like, maybe not. Like there's always, it's hard. It's hard to, it's something that you have to continue to do. It doesn't go away. And then it talks about sexual sin. And the thing with sexual sin, maybe you've been walking in victory from that for so long. Man, your enemy, he is a roaring lion, and he is seeking someone to devour. And as much as you might be like, it has been years, that thing is over, here's what I can tell you. Even if there's tons of time and space behind that action, it can always find its way just like that to creep back in. And when it does, it feels like all that victory that you experienced over those years, you're like, did it even matter? Like there's this part of the text, right, that's kind of like, gosh, seriously? Like I figured this would get easier, and it's like, no, that doesn't. But here's the encouraging part of the text, okay? Paul's writing to Christians. He's writing to people who follow Jesus. And so if there are things in your life where you're like, man, I just thought I'd be further along. Like, he's kind of saying, like, this is how it works. You're going to continue to fight. You're going to continue to struggle. I'm going to give you victory. Things are going to creep back in. And there's this interesting little tension that's here. Like, there's this tension that's created where it's like, well, there's grace, and God's good to you, and he's going to help you. Even if you stumbled, man, like, there's grace. And it doesn't negate the 10 years of victory either. But there's no sense in the text where it's like, even though you walk in victory, you can keep doing that thing. Like, he's not like, well, it's just who you were, just try to stop. Like, that's not it. He's like, put off the old clothes, man. And so one of the ways that we do that, as you see in the text, is we do it by renewing our mind. He says, you put off your old clothes and renew your mind. And I like the image of renewing your mind. It's kind of like fixing your house, you know. I mentioned a few weeks ago that my furnace wasn't working, and it was because I hadn't changed the furnace filter in 2 years. It's amazing. You change it, and it works great. Like this week, it worked great. I'm super thankful because it was very cold, and I didn't want to keep turning it up and trying to make it because that doesn't work. But here's the thing with changing your furnace filter. Like, I have to keep changing it. Like, I can't just be on the 2-year furnace filter plan, Like, that's not how it works. Like, you have to keep changing it. You have to keep going back and doing it. And really, like, when Paul talks about renewing your mind, that's the idea. He says, be renewed in the spirit of your mind. And even if you think about this text, it's really hard when you look at this text to ignore how much your mind is all over it. I mean, just look in these few verses, all the dimensions of your mind, okay? Verse 17, he says, the futility of your mind. Verse 18, he's like, they're darkened in their understanding. Understanding, that's a mental thing. Talks about the ignorance that is in them. Ignorance, that's mental. He says, you learned Christ, that's again mental. You've heard about him and were taught in him. So it's like your mind is all over this thing. And Paul's like, you need to renew that thing. That you got to keep changing that filter. You got to keep doing it. And so how do you do that? And I think there's a few ways that you do it. One is, I can't think of a better way to say it, is I would say knowledge acquisition. Like coming to places, putting yourself in a place where you can like learn something about him. I hope that happens here, but it also needs to happen like beyond here. Like sure, there's incredible value in sitting under biblical teaching, but there's also incredible value in like going home and reading it for yourself. And Paul's saying, renew your mind. Keep keep seeking that. I mean, have you ever read something in the Bible and you've read it before, but you're like, oh, I needed to hear that. What is that? That's the renewing of your mind. It's not like you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to sin. Like it's like, oh, I haven't thought of it like that way, or I needed to be reminded of that. When you're doing that, your mind is being renewed. Like we're getting ready to do Lent next week. We're going to kick off Lent, and we do it with every year for Easter. And we're going to be saying, hey, give up something. Like what is something that you can give up until Easter that'll help you know Jesus better? Like we're going to lean into that. But part of it also is like, what is something that I can add to know Jesus better? Is there something that I could read maybe during this time? What if I pushed myself a little bit harder? What if I found a podcast or something like that where it's like, hey, I want to renew my mind. I want to continue to grow in my acquisition of new knowledge. That's one of the ways you renew your mind. Another way that you renew your mind is by acknowledging the truth. We do this thing sometimes when we're confronted with sin where we're like, I don't know, maybe. Like God's speaking to us, we're like, I don't know. I know I need to do some more research on that, but I'm just going to put that one off. And you might think you're being clever, but God knows what you're doing. Like if God speaks to you and says like, hey, this needs to change, if you say no, you're not renewing your mind. You're not giving God the ability to renew your mind because he's speaking and you're saying no. And so there's this sense of acknowledging the truth. It's saying, this is what he wants and I need to walk in that. It's also, I think, part of renewing our mind is looking at things that might transform our minds in the wrong way. And I think it's worth all of us to consider the music we listen to from time to time, okay? And hear me, like, I'm not saying you should only listen to Christian music. I have a signed Billy Joel album in my office. Like, I'm not saying that. But I would say this, that man, if you're listening to lyrics that are like celebrating sin, things that don't please God, and you're listening to those things over and over again, and you're singing them in your car, and they're stuck in your head, like your mind is being transformed, but not in the way that God would want it to be transformed. It works the same with entertainment. And again, I'm not saying that all of us need to go out and like download all the movies from Angel Studios, but I am saying Like it is worth us considering before we watch something. Is this godless? And it's like, man, if this makes me feel uncomfortable, should I continue to indulge in this? Or maybe this means that I should find something else. Because enough of that over time, what it's going to do is it's going to transform your mind in a way that you don't want your mind to be transformed. It also works this way too with the news. Man, some people, like if you're listening to the news and all it does is make you angry, make you post things on the internet that make you look foolish, that makes you not trust what God is doing, big picture in the world, then your mind is being transformed, but it's being transformed in the wrong way. And Paul's saying, the renewing of your mind, that this is how you walk on the path that you walk on. And so it's worth all of us asking, how is that happening? And then finally, Paul says this, he says to put on a new self. To put on a new self. And he says it's the same way it says in the text of verse 24. He says, put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. So going back to the clothes metaphor, he's saying you got to change. Put on something, take off the old and put on something new. And it looks like behavior. He's saying when you walk with Jesus, you should be able to tell by looking at your life. You know, and I don't know that that's like earth-shaking to anyone here. Maybe it is. Maybe you're new to this whole thing, but I think probably we're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But even though it's true, like I think if we were to be really honest, like we don't always do it. And why? Like we know it, but we don't always take the steps. And I think if it had to boil down to one thing, it's fear. I think in my life before Christ, and I've spent so much time arguing with God about the things that I thought I'd have to give up. I was like, God, I would follow you, but man, I'm scared about losing this. I'm scared about losing this. Hey, this is the thing I don't know. Like, I don't know that I want to be, like, all of those things, it's fear. We're afraid to say, hey, I'm gonna change. Or we'll say, like, God, I'll give you 95%, but I'm gonna hold on to this part. This little part is mine. I'm gonna give you the rest of it, and I'm gonna justify it because I don't look like them. And man, let's go back to that image of that shirt that I had. That's like me wearing that shirt. It's clearly too small. And just saying, I'm going to keep it on. I don't care that I look stupid. I like it. And even I think the image, the example goes even one step further. Because not only is it keeping on a shirt that's like too small, that God would be saying in that example, he's like, hey, I actually have one that fits. Like, you just got to take off the one that doesn't. You're going to you're going to have to get rid of it because you're going to want to put it back on. But if you just trust me and you take it off, I have one for you that you will enjoy a lot more. But you got to trust me with it. And I love the way that God helps us trust him. And you see this in verse 20, and it's a word that's left out, okay? Notice what Paul says. He says, that's not the way that you learned Christ. It's really important that the word about is not in there. He doesn't say that you learned about Christ. He's saying that you learned Christ. And what he is saying is he's saying that when you walk into a relationship with him and you put on new clothes, you're not learning about someone. You're getting to know someone. Maybe you have those moments where you're in a service and you just feel like God is speaking to you. The reason why is because he is. Because it's not just learning about him, it's about learning him. You have those moments where out of the blue, you have this thought and the Spirit of God warms your heart and you're like, I think that's from God. Why? Because he's speaking to you. That he's saying, I get that this is hard. I get that this is scary. I get that you're going to have to change your clothes. But you get to do it with me. And I'll walk with you in this process. Let's pray. God, we love you. We're thankful for who you are. We all like new clothes, God. And I'm thankful that you give them to us. Sometimes it can be uncomfortable. Sometimes it can be difficult. Sometimes it can be all kinds of things, or we're afraid. But the beauty of this is that you offer us something new. You know, and I don't know how it's hitting people, but you do, because you speak. God, maybe there are people in this room or watching online, and the reality of their circumstance is that there are things that they have yet to trust you with. They're serving you, they're Christians, but they just haven't given up certain parts of their life. God, would you help them? God, would you help them to see they can trust you with it? God, would you help them to see that what they're doing is they're wearing an old dingy shirt that doesn't fit and you have one that's better? God, maybe there are people here or watching online and their circumstances, they don't even know you. And what they feel in this moment is they feel you calling them to yourself. And they don't understand what's going on, but the truth is, God, you're speaking. I pray that they would respond. That God, as you're giving them the gift of faith, I pray that you would help them to respond by putting their trust in Jesus Christ. That you would so capture their hearts that they would be able to say, God, whatever you ask, whatever you want, it's yours. I give it to you. God, we thank you. We love you. It's in your name. Amen. Amen. Love you guys.
Thank you so much for watching us today. If you'd like to know more about what's going on here at New Life Church, you can go to our website, nlspringfield.com, and check out everything that's coming up. Also, if you'd like to be part of what God is doing here at New Life by giving, you can do so by going to giving.nlspringfield.com. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.